Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Nicolas Veron. It's my pleasure to introduce this session of the Financial Statement Series at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And today we're talking about sustainable finance, and particularly following up on a discussion we started in this series almost exactly 2 years ago on the International Sustainability Standards Board. At the time, Sue Lloyd had presented on the ISSB in its very infancy. It was barely born, and now 2 years on, we thought it was time to take stock and see how things have developed in those initial years of activity. Sue Lloyd studied accounting and finance, got a master's at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. She worked in investment banking in the UK, in Australia, and in 2002, she joined the International Accounting Standards Board, which at the time was not yet focused on sustainability, as a project manager. A few years later, she joined Goldman Sachs in London and came back to the ISSB in 2009 as technical director, and then in 2014 became a board member. In 2016, a vice chair of the International Accounting Standards Board, and in 2022 was appointed the vice chair of the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is a sister organization to the ISSB, as we will be reminded, under the authority of the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation. Here I have to make a disclosure, which is that, of course, the IFRS Foundation is chaired by Erkki Liikanen, who is also the chairman of Bruegel, my other employer in Brussels. Sylvie Goulard studied law at University of Aix-Marseille in southern France, at Sciences Po Paris. She entered ENA, the National School of Administration, the name has changed in the meantime, where she graduated in 1989. She then joined the French Foreign Ministry, worked there also at the French Council of State, the Conseil d'État, and from 1999 to 2001 at the CERI, the Center of International Research, the International Affairs Research Center of Sciences Po. In 2001, she became an advisor to Romano Prodi, the president of the European Commission in Brussels. She worked there for 3 years on matters of European integration, and including the constitutional treaties that was under elaboration and later rejection at the time. In 2004, she then became an affiliate faculty at the College of Europe. She also was elected president of the European Movement in France, and in 2009 was elected French member of the European Parliament for the Modem Party for a mandate that she held after re-election until 2017. She was briefly Minister of Defense, or of the Armed Forces, as it was called in France at the time, and in 2018 became Deputy Governor of the Central Bank, National Central Bank, the Bank of France, a position she held until 2022. At the Bank of France, Sylvie Goulard was very active in the early steps of sustainable finance. She was particularly instrumental in building up the network for greening the financial system, which is a network of central bankers in this area, and in a number of other initiatives. After leaving the Bank of France in 2022, she became a professor of practice last year at SDA Bocconi, the business school of Bocconi University of Milan. She's also the president of the Franco-German Institute in Ludwigsburg in Germany. She's the vice president of the Institute for European Policymaking at Bocconi University in Milan. And last but not least, she's the co-chair of the International Advisory Panel on biodiversity credit, so that's sustainable finance, but going beyond climate. This is a Franco-British initiative that is going to provide recommendations in the context of the COP conference cycle. With that, Sue, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, and thank you for the introduction. So I'm going to try and see if my technology will work, and just set the scene a little bit in the first 10 minutes or so by talking about what we have been doing. Indeed, as Nicolas said, since I last presented 2 years ago, having been very busy at the ISSB since then. So just to set the scene, maybe it's worth going back and reminding us all why the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, was indeed established by the IFRS Foundation in the first place, way back now, it seems a long time ago at COP26. The announcement was made to establish this new board, and that was in response to a consultation where our global stakeholders had confirmed to our oversight body, the trustees, that there was indeed the need for an international standard setter in this space to make sure that investors had high quality information that they could really rely on to make informed investment decisions, to understand how sustainability risks and opportunities would affect the prospects of companies that they might invest in, and to reduce the complexity of a reporting environment where, paradoxically, we didn't have too little disclosure, but perhaps an overload of different disclosures from different regimes, which was quite confusing both for companies and for investors trying to navigate that landscape. So we were brought in to try to simplify the landscape. And this slide here just shows how busy we've been since back in COP26. So very early, part of what the ISSB did was to consolidate with some existing established sustainability standard setters to reduce the complexity of the landscape. So bringing on board the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board and the Integrated Reporting Framework and the Climate Disclosure Standards Board as part of the creation of our new board. And a huge milestone for us was indeed publishing our first two standards at the end of June last year. A general standard, IFRS S1, which sets out the general requirements for reporting across all sustainability risks and opportunities, and asks that that information be co-located with the financial statements. And then a specific standard, IFRS S2, our climate standard, which sets out specific climate-related disclosures. We were delighted that very quickly after that publication at the end of June last year, the international securities regulators, IOSCO, for only the second time in their lives, endorsed our standards as being fit for use in global capital markets and encouraging jurisdictions around the world to make use of our standards, to make sure that investors around the world benefit from this high quality, comparable information in global capital markets. Around that same time, in July last year, we were also delighted that the Financial Stability Board took the step to formally dissolve the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. They basically said that we see the work of the TCFD as now being complete because IFRS S1 and S2 took on board and incorporated in the standards the TCFD recommendations. So those were all really important milestones in the journey of the ISSB. And I'll come back also to our work with Europe. The other thing that we focused on at COP28 last year was launching our Knowledge Hub and really ramping up our capacity building program to help working with others to get the market ready for this big change in financial reporting. So having done that in the last 2 years, what are we doing now looking forward? The first thing that we are doing is really helping those who are using our new standards. To require so many companies around the world to provide sustainability information and to encourage it to be at the level of quality that we're used to with financial statements is an enormous change management exercise. So one of the things we're doing is making sure that people have the materials they need to apply our standards and to apply them well, and that they have the education they need to implement these standards and consume the information. So we have a big capacity building program working directly and with others. The second thing we're focusing our attention on, and I'll come back to this in detail in a moment, is the adoption of our standards. It's all very well to have standards published, but we want standards to be used. And so a huge amount of our time and energy at the moment is focused on this adoption journey of our standards around the world. And as any good standard setter, we're looking forward. We've published 2 standards, but that's just the beginning. And so we are making decisions about what our future work plan would look like. What do we work on next to build on our initial framework in IFRS S1 and our initial climate disclosures? So looking at this adoption journey, looking forward, we don't do this in isolation. As I said, the international securities regulators, IOSCO, have endorsed our standards. We work closely with IOSCO and their members to look at adoption of our standards around the world. We're thrilled that the international audit regulators, the ISSB, is working on standards for the assurance of sustainability information. We're working with jurisdictions directly, and also we're talking to companies and to investors. As I like to say, you don't need to be told by a regulator to do a good thing. It makes sense for companies to use our standards to communicate to markets, to attract capital. And so many companies, including in the United States, are interested in choosing to apply our standards. And so that's a really important part of the adoption conversations that we are involved in. But let's pivot to jurisdictional adoption for a moment, because that is what has been the core of the success of our sister board, the International Accounting Standards Board. And what we really want to see is jurisdictional adoption of the ISSB standards. On this slide here is 19 different jurisdictions that are in the process of consulting on or introducing sustainability regulations domestically that would build on or incorporate the ISSB standards. And you can see, looking at this slide, that there's a whole range of different types of jurisdictions here, and they're taking different approaches. We've got some really large capital markets. Brazil, who are requiring the use of our standards from 2026. Canada, who are consulting on the use of our standards at the moment. We have Japan, who are developing their own sustainability standards. They have proposals out at the moment, and those standards would result in the same disclosures as using the ISSB standards directly. We also have some slightly different jurisdictions. You'll see here, for example, Kenya and Nigeria. And we were really delighted that very early in the journey of the ISSB, these markets, which are so critical in global supply chains, have shown their interest in using our standards as a way of supporting their sustainable development and trading flows. A name you didn't see on the previous slide, but of course is a huge player in the sustainability reporting space, is the European Union. And this has been a very particular source of engagement at the ISSB, and I personally have been very involved in these discussions. Europe's very special when it comes to sustainability reporting because they were first. They moved very early on through the Green Deal, the CSRD, to require sustainability reporting. And in July last year, they published their European Sustainability Reporting Standards, or ESRS, which don't incorporate quite so directly the ISSB standards because they started first. But where, of course, we want to make sure that if you're a company that's using the ISSB standards and ESRS, that's as efficient and effective as possible. So we've been deeply engaged in discussions with the European Commission and the European standard setter, EFRAG, for several years now to make sure that as we developed our standards where we could, we aligned disclosures. And at the moment, we're very close to being able to communicate to the market a document that explains how to apply both our climate disclosure requirements and the European disclosure requirements in a way that reduces the risk of duplication in reporting and is as efficient as possible for companies using both sets of standards. Before I hand back to you, Nicolas, just to touch base on the future work plan and where we're looking forward now as we progress to develop our sustainability reporting beyond the climate-specific disclosures. We consulted last year on this, and our stakeholders gave us some very clear messages. One is there's a lot to do just applying IFRS S1 and IFRS S2, so don't get too carried away. So we've heard that message loud and clear. People need help to get going well on this journey. So our number one priority is supporting the implementation and adoption of our standards around the world. The next most important things we will focus on are two things. Further enhancing and developing our industry-specific standards that we inherited from the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board to make sure they're fit for use around the world to enable broad reporting on an industry-specific basis. And then we will spend an equal amount of time on some new projects. And those were just decided last week at our Frankfurt board meeting. The board decided to commence research on two new topic areas to build specific sustainability disclosures. The first, which hopefully is music to Sylvie's ears, is biodiversity, ecosystems, and ecosystem services, indicating that we'll build where we can from the work of others, including the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures. The second area that we will dig into and research is disclosures about human capital, things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, the amount that you're spending training your workforce, because of course this is really critical to the future prospects and success of companies. So these two new areas are where we will start researching, and we expect to publish an overview of our future work plan, where we landed and why, given the feedback that we got, and a feedback statement, which we are on track to publish before the end of June this year. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was masterful. Sylvie.
Well, thanks a lot, and thanks for this presentation, Sue. It's impressive, the work you did with the team of ISSB in the last 2 years. I could not agree more with the importance on having reliable data and to allow investors to make informed decisions. Above all, as many jurisdictions have not yet adopted compulsory disclosure rules, which is a pity to a certain extent, because, as you said, you don't need to wait for regulators, of course, but scientists tell us that some issues at stake, climate and nature or biodiversity loss, are very urgent and are going to impact the value chains. This is the point I want to make. It's not just about being green. It's not just about the planet, even if we have some moral duties for the next generations. It is about business and value chains. So I'm co-chairing right now with Dame Amelia Fawcett an international panel dealing with, we would like to help create and scale up new financial instruments to preserve nature, to restore and conserve. And it is clear that here, if we have data, we can, if we know what companies are doing, we can make enlightened and informed decisions. So we hope to have a set of principles, a coalition and pilots project in Cali at the next biodiversity COP in October 2024. And it is about creating markets, and it is about high integrity products. So we don't want at all these fields to allow people to trap investors. So the more you can go in the direction of biodiversity and nature, the better it is. First, because it is urgent for scientists. Second, because it is important for companies, for their business models. And if you look at the way you present things, sustainability is more than climate, and it's definitely more than climate. And it was stressed by IPCC and IPBES together already in 2021. So we should be very careful if we slice a little bit the problems, climate first and then the rest. So I hope that you can accelerate your work in order for companies to have worldwide an excellent framework to rely upon. I remember last June in Paris, when President Macron organized the summit on people and planet, we had a representative of Nigeria in our round table on these issues. And it's fascinating, as you said, to see countries in the South endorsing your work and seeing their interest for them of being part of this global process. It's not a way of patronizing them at all. It is in the interest of all jurisdictions to make sure that money is well employed. My very last point, I'm glad as well that you moved to a human dimension, because we do a lot with Amelia Fawcett and the panel members, under which we have, for example, David Craig, who's played such a big role in the TNFD framework, and I hope you can work upon this achievement. It is that we very rapidly see the link with the social issues. So you cannot transform the economies with the magnitude required by what we know from scientists without having people on board. So in our panel, we insist a lot on including the indigenous people and local communities. One more alphabet soup, IPLCs. It is very important in some countries in the South, of course, because of the rights indigenous people have on their territory, because of the knowledge they have in scientific terms, and they are the stewards of nature. But I really believe that also in our countries, if we don't include and motivate our local populations, we will not go anywhere. So everything you do is fantastic. I'm a big fan of your work, but we need to see that it goes beyond having the right tools, and data are tools, frameworks, and auditing is an important way. But at the end, it has to do with the way we move, live, consume, and envisage the future, and we need the people on board. So I stop here. My message was more nature and biodiversity, but nature biodiversity cannot be separated from climate on the one hand and from the human being on the ground on the other hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvie. And indeed, I think you illustrate a number of the trade-offs here, right? Because there are so many objectives, and at the same time, there are, everything is priority, but there has to be identifiable progress, I guess, on at least some of those dimensions. Sue, I'd like to start our conversation maybe, and I see we already have questions from the floor, but if you can give us a kind of snapshot of where the ISSB is as an organization. You mentioned offices in London, Frankfurt, Montreal, Beijing, maybe I missed some. How does that work in practice? How large is the organization? What kind of organizational challenges do you meet, if any? Can you give us a sense of the concrete work of the standard setter before we get to the standards themselves?
Sure. So you're right. We're a bit different to our sister board, which was very much a London-based organization with a smaller office, Oceania office based in Tokyo. Right from the start, we've been set up as a multi-location office, really with the desire to make sure we were very close to our different stakeholders around the world, given we're on such a change management journey and we really need to be close to our stakeholders. So what does that mean in practice? That means that we have offices in a number of jurisdictions. So Frankfurt is the seat of the chair and me. Montreal is the seat of my fellow vice chair. Then we have an office in Tokyo. Beijing. We have an office in San Francisco as a result of the consolidation with the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. And in addition to that, we have people in our London office as well. So quite a diverse footprint of offices around the world with staff in all of those different offices. And in terms of size, our total organization now is around, I think, 300 people. So it's about double the size it was before the ISSB was born. What does that mean in practice? It means that we're very good at meeting on teams, I would say, is one of the things that we're very good at in practice. It also means that what we do to work with our stakeholders and our officers is that we hold our meetings in different jurisdictions. Our general pattern is that the largest number of our meetings is held in Frankfurt, and then another big chunk of our board meetings, our monthly meetings, are held in Montreal. And we try to have about one meeting a year, board meeting, that we hold in our in one of our Asian locations. And then in addition to that, at the moment, because of this adoption journey that we're on, we are all over the place because it's just still, no matter how good virtual interactions are, when it comes to talking to people about really getting behind adopting new standards, making regulatory changes, making big systems changes, there's still benefit in talking to people. So a lot of what we're doing at the moment is engaging with our stakeholders all around the world to really guide people on the decisions they're making on the use of our standards around the world and to work with them as they think about what they might need to do on capacity building. So that gives you, I think, a bit of a flavor of the organization.
I'd like to come back to the adoption journey, as you called it. Sylvie, you were a member of the European Parliament at the time when there was a lot of discussion, even controversy, about the EU's commitment to international standards, not just international financial reporting standards issued by the ISSB, the sister body of the ISSB, but also the Basel standards, a number of other initiatives coming from the Financial Stability Board, the Bank for International Settlements, and other related organizations. Can you give us a sense of your view of the European debates on adoption of the ISSB standards? Sue gave us a kind of very diplomatic sense of the alignment between the ISSB and its peers in the EU, EFRAG, and the European Commission. How is that going? What is your view that we will get to a point where the EU can be viewed as in line with the global sustainability standards, or will it go for a Sonderweg?
So there are many questions in your question. The first one has to do, and it has nothing to do with the work of ISSB, or you mentioned other bodies. In democracies, rules should be, at the end, adopted by accountable people. So you have experts that can do a lot of work, and the need for international cooperation in a globalized world is key. I'm not at all denying it, but at least my position was not to accept that some standards or rules made behind closed doors by experts can be, at the end, adopted like this by parliaments. And it was more at that time, the discussion at my time was more on the Basel regulations on banking than specifically on sustainability. So the question of democracy, of the mix of accountability and expertise, independent expertise is needed, but also democratic debate is also needed. And to be honest, the balance was not always there, but my position may be very different from position from other colleagues who were not so much worried about this issue and was sometimes making battles for other reasons. The second point I wanted to make was on sustainability and your more precise question on Europe, etc. As you said, the Europeans, maybe because Europe is a smaller continent where we destroyed even more nature, where the industrial revolution took place, etc., was more aware on the urgency of all these rules, etc. So the Europeans moved first, and when you move first, you may have a tendency to believe that you are better than the others and you want the others to align. So the question for many Europeans is, will the rest of the world align on us? And it's, in both cases, not the way it's going to function. I remember perfectly Erkki Liikanen in Glasgow saying that what we hope is that Europe can be one of the building blocks of something global, where, of course, jurisdiction keep a certain margin of maneuver to adapt and to take into consideration local elements, or give space to democratic accountability and to what we would like to see everywhere as the right legislative process. My concern, to be honest, right now, years after my mandate at the European Parliament, is, are we quick enough for the topics we are facing? I mean, climate change is real. We don't see everywhere a decrease in fossil fuel consumptions. Of course, we perfectly understand that in the South, countries want to get development, education, access to energy. This is perfectly legitimate. But how can we make sure that it happens, that the money goes where it is needed in the South to scale up sustainability? And we are not where we should be. With all the efforts, all the panels and institutions, whatever are doing, we are not globally where we should be. It's not a question of being a diplomat or not. And once again, I don't at all put the blame on the people of goodwill on earth trying to do their contribution. But the truth is that we don't have a global government. We don't have the capacity to control what is happening. So we are in a second best. And in this second best, we do what we can. And I hope that even Europe is not going to be the victim of the pushback we observe everywhere on earth, as if we would have more time for climate change and biodiversity loss.
Sue, Sylvie alluded to the different approach of Europe in this area, and particularly there has been this debate about double materiality, which we discussed 2 years ago. You told us that there was no contradiction between the approach of Europeans of measuring impact of climate change on individual companies and also on the planet, impact of the companies on climate change on the planet, which is a kind of double materiality concept. I probably didn't summarize it exactly right. And the approach of the ISSB, which focuses on the former more than the latter. Can you give us a sense of how this debate, which was a little bit theological at the beginning on double materiality versus the ISSB approach, has evolved in the last 2 years?
Sure. And this isn't just me being diplomatic. So I've spent a lot of time with the Commission and with the EFRAG talking about We try actually not to talk about, materiality perspectives, because it just turns into a conceptual debate which doesn't move us forward too quickly, but really focusing on the reality of where we landed, which has been the approach we've taken on climate, where we have the benefit of both having specific disclosure requirements set out in detail. And what that shows is, I think, a couple of really interesting things. Firstly, basically everything that we ask for in IFRS S2, which is designed to focus on meeting the needs of investors, which, by the way, includes lots of things about impact. So, for example, investors are very interested in even scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions, because it really affects the transition that a company might need to make in its business model. Our disclosures are basically all included in ESRS. So everything we cover, Europe covers plus some more. And the plus some more is, I think, where the different materiality perspective comes in. What we see, though, is that plus some more sort of comes about for a couple of different reasons. One is because Europe has got some very particular pieces of legislation or policy that the disclosures need to work well with. So, for example, some of the disclosures are about the EU taxonomy. But then also some of the disclosures are about very particular aspects of climate that are not so much investor relevant, but interesting pieces of information such as energy efficiency, which might be needed for other reasons, policy-related reasons and other reasons in Europe. So where we really see a difference is on climate, really almost there's more overlap than there is difference. And so for me, this has really confirmed that often we talk as though there's a huge difference in outcomes between so-called double materiality and an investor focus. I think on something like climate, just about everything that's interesting to the man on the street is also interesting to investors as well. And we really see that in climate disclosures. What I think is going to be interesting to see sort of intellectually going forward as we look at new topics like human capital and biodiversity, do we see that same level of overlap and commonality, or are there more differences because investors are not focused quite so comprehensively on those topics just yet as they are in the climate space? And so I think it's going to be interesting to see the extent to which there's really a conceptual difference in these two things and how different it is by topic. And so I'm interested to actually see how that unfolds.
Indeed,
but what we do want to do is make it as easy as possible for companies, because the last thing I want to do, going back to where Sylvie made a point that I really agreed with early on, which was we want to really be doing things to make sure that we're affecting change. I don't really want companies reporting for reporting's sake. I really hope that what we're doing here is encouraging companies to think in a broad way, to think about the risks and value chains and other things to really govern their businesses well. So they're set up to create value, sustain businesses, and have a good future as a company going forward. And then they report on that, as opposed to this being all about an exercise just for reporting's sake. And I think the success will be if we can get to the stage where this isn't a compliance exercise, but it's really information that businesses really embrace as part of what they understand and manage to do things well. And then I think we will all benefit from that.
You mentioned the overlap or underlap between the two sets, right? You had a slide where there were two circles and the Venn diagram was one of almost perfect alignment, but there was a little bit that was in the European circle, not in your circle. So that's what you referred to as plus more. But there was also a little bit that was in the ISSB circle and not in the European circle. So is there any such thing right now, and what part of the ESRS, the European standards, is not in line or doesn't fulfill the requirement of ISSB as we currently have them?
So the particular piece of information that's not expressly required in ESRS at the moment, but you can sort of provide, and then you would meet the ISSB requirements on climate, is particular disclosures that we require on financed emissions. So we both ask for financed emissions, so information about so-called category 15 scope 3 GHG emissions for those geeks that are listening. So the emissions that are sort of related to the lending or investments that you make with companies, so financing the business that results in emissions. We both ask for that. But we go further and we ask for some more information from commercial banks, insurance companies and asset managers on the industries that they're lending to, and some more granular information about the emissions by industry. And so that's information that we have learned is very investor relevant. That's a level of detail that's not in ESRS at the moment, particularly because EFRAG is still developing the sector-specific requirements for the ESRS requirements. And this is, as I said, particular to particular businesses. So that's the particular piece of the sliver that we've identified for climate at the moment.
I'm ignorant of these things and it's moving fast, but isn't there an element of that in the prudential requirements, for example, of the ECB as a supervisor, that banks should report on financed emissions and the emissions of their borrowers and customers? Maybe Sylvie?
Yeah, no, I wanted to say, first of all, Sue, I'm so glad to hear that sometimes Europe is not over-regulating, which is the main the main idea floating around during the European campaign. And I wanted actually to add that there is a prudential element and that there is even a very interesting study of the ECB on the biodiversity side. I just wanted to flag it for you, Sue. If you're in Frankfurt, you can pay a visit to Frank Elderson and Christine. They are doing a fantastic job. And last year, they published a study in which they made clear that 72% of the loans distributed within the euro area are distributed to companies that are dependent or highly dependent from ecosystem services. 72% for the euro area, which is huge. And of course, something we have to take care, at least in terms of financial stability, but also in terms of value chain. So what I wanted to say is that, in my opinion, if you put all together what the companies face, and sometimes there are also national regulations, like in France on biodiversity, it was the case before the adoption of the EU framework. The main message is really that, in my opinion, we should more look at what we have in common and how we can trigger the whole movement of business in the right direction, instead of sometimes having disputes on some technical issues, because there were enough disputes between the Europeans and the rest, and the matter is too urgent to allow this kind of approach.
I'd like to move on from Europe to other large jurisdictions, because in your slide on adoption, Sue, you had some fairly large jurisdictions like Japan, the UK, Canada mentioned, but and Europe was in the next slide. But let's move to the US and China. You have offices, as you reminded us, in both Beijing and San Francisco. We have a question in the Q&A from Jean-Christophe Perrin on how things are going in the USA, where lawsuits are underway to block the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, from enforcing non-financial reporting. Can you give us a sense both of adoption of financial disclosure, sustainability-related disclosure requirements in the US and also in China, even so we're fully aware of the differences in systems, and to which extent ISSB work is relevant to those two major jurisdictions?
Sure. And the first thing I'd say is that we have a jurisdictional working group that we established very early in the life of the ISSB, which is made up of members of the regulatory community from different markets who have been very important in developing our first two standards and in adoption conversations since then. And both China and the US are members of that group. So we work very closely with them both. On the US side of things, I think we're thrilled that the rule has been finalized in the US. So we have, progress forward in terms of actual rule being published in the US. Obviously, there's more on that story, but that's a good step forward. And also, one of the things we were really pleased to see in that rule is that there are references to the ISSB's relevance as a global standard setter in the details of that rule, in particular noting that the ISSB requirements had been considered, but that it was considered a bit early at the moment to be going down that path. But it was great to have that sort of name check, if you like, in the US requirements. On the Chinese front, we were very happy when the Beijing office was open to see the level of support from the Ministry of Finance in China for the opening of that office. And China is certainly a jurisdiction we're in very close conversations with as they make their decisions in terms of their path forward on sustainability reporting. It's good also to see in the last few weeks that in Hong Kong, there's been progress on the stock exchange listing requirements there in Hong Kong, including encouragement to use our standards in full from a climate perspective. So good to see, I think, really good progress in that region with more to come.
Any views on the US and China? Yeah.
No, maybe 2 words on US and China. The first thing I would say is that we are all embedded in nature, as Professor Dasgupta wrote for the British government some years ago, which means that no country, even the largest and the most powerful, can escape the challenge and the risks, and should oversee the opportunities. I really think it's important to all remember that we are part of nature, and we cannot consider this is something that is going to wait until the next election. It's not something that is going to wait until we are ready, and it is true for the Europeans as well. So the second point is that I remember that the NGFS, and it is very interesting to underline, the Chinese put a lot of emphasis of having a broad approach. The charter of the NGFS includes not only climate but environment, thanks to the PBOC. And if you look at what they did on
Bank of China,
the People's Bank of China, sorry for the acronym. So I really believe, and my experience at the G20 finance track, when the Italian government at the time of Mario Draghi relaunched the Sustainable Finance Working Group and gave the presidency to the US and China together, it was a very smart idea in order to put everyone, and once again, I'm not choosing, we all have to commit ourselves, we all have internal problems, and the size of these economies, of course, make it so important, because you can have a very long list of jurisdiction joining whatever effort, be it our effort on biodiversity credit, be yours. If you don't have the big players, of course, the impact is not the same.
Sylvie made a comment very early on about the sort of the risks of thinking about some of these risks in silos. And so I wondered if I could just comment on that briefly. So Sylvie, I think rightly was pointing out that, you know, climate very quickly links into nature, very quickly links into social issues. And I just wanted to sort of endorse that. And one of the really important things that we did just before the end of last year was publish some educational material on sort of good practice, if you like, or examples of application of our climate standard. Because I think there's a real risk when you say to people, oh, we require climate information, everybody thinks greenhouse gas emissions. And we wanted to be clear that climate isn't just greenhouse gas emissions. And the two things that we highlighted in those examples was the nature-related aspects of climate change and also some of the human capital aspects of climate change. And there was a few examples that we used there, and just to highlight a couple. One was the fact that if you have particular industries that you're in, water shortages caused by climate change could well be a key risk that you should be providing information about when we talk about climate disclosures. And S2 requires that. You don't need me to write S3 to ask for that. And one of the other examples that we had in there was that if you set out your transition planning for to mitigate climate risks, and you're needing to adjust the way that your I don't know, your business model works, your plant and machinery, your products that you produce, that has consequences for your workforce, information about what you're there for doing to retrain members of your workforce, or how you're dealing with unions, all of those sort of social aspects of climate, that's a climate-related risk. And so don't just look at S2 and think, okay, you only have to think about climate now, and this is a silo, don't have to worry about nature, don't have to worry about social. Because I think one of the important aspects of sustainability risks is they're so interconnected. It's one of the things that makes them quite complicated to think through. And it's really, really important, to Sylvie's point, not to think, okay, this is my climate disclosure, this is my nature disclosure, this is my social disclosure, because there's lots of connections between those things.
So you reminded us of IFRS S1 and IFRS S2, more acronyms, so International Financial Reporting Standards, sustainability related, number 1 and 2. Can you remind us of what exactly is in S1 and S2, what will be in S3 or the next standard you will issue, and how that connects with the other stuff you referred to, which is enhanced SASB standards, so industry-specific standards that initially were issued by the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which you absorbed basically with the kind of architecture or typology of your ISSB standards.
Sure, love to. So if you think about the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures recommendations, the TCFD, as many of you will know, they ask for information on 4 things: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets. Both S1 and S2 use that structure. So S1 says, tell us about all of your sustainability-related risks and opportunities that are reasonably expected to affect your prospects, your cash flows, your business model, your ability to get funding and the cost of that funding. Tell us about the range of sustainability-related risks and opportunities, and tell us about how you're governing them, the strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And to do that for topics beyond climate, where we have S2, we refer to third-party materials, including our own SASB standards, which set out across a range of sustainability topics, information by industry that has been identified as being relevant for investors. We say, please look at that. And then we say, there's other things you could look at. And by the way, you could look at the European standards, ESRS, or the GRI standards, where that information is investor material. So that's the first important thing that S1 does. The other important thing that S1 does is that it explains what we mean by materiality, that the information provided needs to be that which is really important for investors. So important, it could be reasonably expected to actually influence an investment decision. That's explained in S1. The other important thing S1 does is it says, this information that we're asking you to provide has to be co-located with the financial statements, has to be published together at the same time, and you need to explain how what you're saying over here about sustainability relates to what you've got in the financial statements. The assumptions should be consistent to the extent that the accounting allows that, and if it's different, tell me why. And so it's setting up the timing and the location and making sure this information is now related and really well connected to the financial statements, which is what investors have been asking for. So that's S1. When you identify climate as something really important to tell your investors about, and I think pretty much every company should reach that conclusion, you then pick up S2. And S2 sets out specific disclosures related to climate. And basically S2 picks up the TCFD recommendations on climate, has made them a bit more robust so they're fit for enforceability by regulators around the world, but pretty much what was covered in the TCFD recommendations, so information, again, about governance, strategy, risk management, greenhouse gas emissions, scenario analysis, that's all in S2. And the last thing I should say about S1 and S2, which is really important, is that unlike the TCFD recommendations for climate, but also for everything else that's covered by S1, we require that industry-specific information be provided. And that's because when investors talk to us about sustainability, they say that in this space, the business that you're in really determines what's relevant information. And if you think about it, the information you need to know for how climate change is going to affect your business is going to be pretty different if you're an airline or a food retailer or a mining company. And so industry specificity is really at the heart of both of our standards.
I've been a board member of the ISSB, and the ISSB has the strong philosophy of not being industry specific, right? I mean, it's been kind of a running thread in the life of the ISSB against some national traditions that there wouldn't be special standards for banking or real estate or, other specific industries. So is that a kind of case of being of two minds? How is the philosophy, the non-industry specific philosophy of the ISSB living together with the industry-specific philosophy of the ISSB using the SASB standards?
I don't think they're totally different, to be honest. I think people do focus on that as a difference, but let me give you some examples. So even though you're right, everybody picks up the revenue standard that the IASB has written, and hopefully everybody's got some revenue to account for. If you look at something like the insurance standard, that's fairly, related to a particular industry. There's an investment property standard that's probably pretty related to particular industries. And even if we get to financial instruments, my old stomping ground, if you get to the impairment accounting, the expected credit loss model, everybody probably needs to think about that a little bit. If you're a company that's got receivables, you probably need to think about it. But I think the people spending the hours poring over that are probably the banking industry. So I think it's true. It isn't so much labeled as being industry specific, but the relevance and the amount to which you might need to refer to a particular accounting standard, I think can very much vary by industry. So I think it's a little bit overblown, the difference between the two.
You mentioned enforceability of the standards. Can you give us a sense of the experience so far? Are any of the ISSB standards already enforceable in some jurisdictions? Are there lessons from early experiences, or if not, when are the deadlines when we will see enforcement, the enforcement clock starting to tick, so to say?
I think so these standards are available for use when people choose to use them, but the rubber really hits the road in a big way when jurisdictions start to require the standards to be used. And the timing of that is very jurisdiction specific. But we have Brazil looking at 2026 with voluntary use applicable from now. We have Turkey coming in, I think, in 25. And so we will start to see the sort of real application and enforcement in the very near future. But what we're already seeing is jurisdictions getting ready for that. So we're certainly working very actively with the international securities regulators through IOSCO with a lot of training programs around the world, for example, to start the regulatory community to be up and running, ready for this enforcement journey that's ahead of us all. And it's so very important, because to get this robust information, I mean, it's serious business when people are going to make investment decisions based on this material. The enforcement piece of the jigsaw puzzle is a really, really important one, as is the assurance one, which is another conversation that's going on in parallel.
So let me move to some of the politics of this, and maybe turning to Sylvie. We've seen a lot of backlash, particularly in the last 2 years, not just in the US, also in Europe, against the burden of over-reporting, and also, what is painted by some as a woke ideology. So this has become very divisive in the US, and ESG itself has become a bit of a loaded label in US politics to a remarkable extent, actually, in terms of the attitude of investors, which no longer proclaims their commitment to ESG the ways it did 2 years ago when we had that previous conversation, Sue. But we also see that very prominently in the campaign for the European Parliament elections this year, with a number of anti-system or non-mainstream parties saying that things like ESG burdens are killing the economy and are not in the interest of voters. So how is the trade-off to be managed? Sylvie, you highlighted rightly the urgency of fighting climate change, but there seems to be a lot of resistance from the body politic. How should a standard setter like the ISB manage the trade-off between the sense of urgency and the imperative of acceptability?
Well, it's one of the most difficult questions one can ask right now. I would make a difference between two things. One thing is to say rules should be well calibrated, and we are all making experiments. It was not the case in the past. We had no disclosure, we had no instruments. So to a certain extent, if people in good faith complain that at a certain moment there is a need for some fine-tuning, I think we should be quite open to this. This is normal. You never calibrate well rules in a completely new field. But there is something beyond this. There is the denial of the gravity of the topic. And I would even say the political use of arguments that are not acceptable in systems where we pretend that markets are rational. I'm not even saying that I'm not talking about the political system. They were never rational. But we continue to pretend that investors and companies make rational decisions. And from this point of view, once again, I'm just stressing that's what scientists are saying. Climate change and biodiversity loss are two urgent, serious, and if we wait too long, irreversible phenomena. So the idea, let's be realistic, it cannot be good for the economy. It is simply something that is not acceptable and should not be accepted. Maybe I'm tough, maybe I'm no more in charge, maybe it's easy.
You've been, sorry to interrupt, you've been an elected politician, right? And if policymakers don't have a mandate from their voters for this kind of things, they cannot act. So how is it a matter of education?
Nicolas, you have a very, I know it's mainstream, but I personally, maybe that's the reason why I'm no more in politics, but I don't share this very passive version of policymakers. Are people really informed? Are people taking measures, taking the time not only to explain, but to listen and to co-construct with the ones who are the target? I will take another example. All the studies of Esther Duflo and Banerjee at the MIT, and they got the Nobel Prize for that, showed that if you don't involve the populations you want to take measure for fighting against poverty, you fail. On climate and nature, I have the feeling we made exactly the same mistake. So it's not that you can say, I wait until my electorate gives me a mandate. As a politician, you are also responsible for the future of the planet and also for the future of business. Because it is not true that the kind of agriculture we are supporting in Europe right now is sustainable in the sense that it is going to bring revenues to the people using pesticides as much as they do. We know that the artificialization of soil is a real issue. We know that water scarcity, and Sue was perfectly right to underline at least the link between climate and nature through water. I always say to people, if you don't know what to begin with your impact and dependencies on water, and then you will realize the magnitude. So I know it is not an easy stuff, but in the Federalist paper, you have a fantastic Federalist paper where the writers explained in the 18th century that you cannot consider democracy something where you wait until people support what you do. And once again, many people, as you said, are willing to act. They are aware and they don't know how. And I really fear that our democracies are at risk if we continue to consider that democracy should function this way. And I don't talk about authoritarian regimes. They have their own problems. Sometimes they plan very well, and in my opinion, they are not sustainable because at the end, their own people will not support what they are doing. But
Sue, do you have a political analyst in your team? Do you follow those political trends? Of course, you're not in the political space, but it informs the work you can deploy.
We're watching very carefully the conversations going on, would be what I would say. So we try and stay as well informed as we possibly can be, given our size. But I think that one of the points that Sylvie made, which I would totally agree with, which I sort of keep my focus on as a standard setter, is the calibration point. I think you have to be careful to make sure that there is a good reason for the information that's asked for. And if we can get good calibration between the information that it's so important that it really could be expected to influence an investment decision, something that's that important should be important enough that the board is interested in it as well for good governance. And sometimes when people say to me, you know, how can you ask me to provide information on Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions because that's in my value chain and that's not me? You need to understand your value chain even to understand immediate risks like physical risk now. If you're waiting for materials to be delivered and you're reliant on rivers or the Panama Canal, or you're delivering goods and you're reliant on being able to deliver, you need to know what's happening in your value chain to be able to make sure you're aware of risks and you can govern them. And so I think really making sure that the information asked is a proportionate one that really focuses on the stuff that matters is the key to success here, because then there's a value for companies and investors and others in that information. And I think that's the sweet spot that we really need to make sure that we focus on.
That's an a thoughtful point to conclude our conversation on, because we are at the hour. I want to thank very warmly Sylvie Goulard and Sue Lloyd for an illuminating conversation on these issues. We'll come back to those issues. And also the next session will be on related concerns, actually, because we will talk about how the auditing process supports the needs or doesn't support the need of investors, together with Sabah Kamar, who is the investor advocate of the US audit regulators, Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. That will be in 2 weeks' time on May 14. In the meantime, again, many thanks to our two speakers and to the audience for participating today, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.